On the morning of Sunday, July 13th, 2003, 26-year-old Tabitha Bryant walked through the front door of her big white house in Penfield, New York, which was an upper-middle-class suburb of Rochester. Her husband, Kevin, and their 2 young sons followed her inside, and they were all dressed in their Sunday best because they had just come back from church. However, on this morning, Tabitha sort of felt like a fraud because she knew she was not really living a Christian lifestyle. So Tabitha was actually having an affair with a guy named Keith. And her husband Kevin, who was 45 and nearly 20 years her senior, he had recently found out about it and confronted her about it. Tabitha, during this confrontation, had promised Kevin that she would end the affair. And then she and Kevin had agreed that they really needed to work on their marriage together. But despite sort of coming to a kind of resolution, it was very obvious that Kevin was still very mad at her. And so Tabitha had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den ever since. Now, Tabitha watched as Kevin grabbed his briefcase off the kitchen counter, he kissed their 2 boys goodbye, and then he walked back out to his car. Tabitha was used to him disappearing to the office on the weekends. Kevin was a lawyer, and he worked basically all the time. And, they did depend on his salary, his big salary, to pay their mortgage and also finance their expensive lifestyle with vacations and lots of nights out. Now, despite Kevin's salary being so sizable, they had for a while tried to supplement his income by renting out a bedroom in their house to Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril Weinbrenner, and his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. However, that arrangement, despite it being profitable for the couple, had ultimately soured when Cyril, the half-brother, had begun using drugs inside of the house. And so Cyril and Cassidy had moved out 2 months earlier. But despite, the terms on which they left, the group, Cyril, Cassidy, Tabitha, Kevin, their family, they remained friends, and they would still actually spend time together on the weekends. It was just they were not able to live together. Now, Tabitha, she did like having that extra money coming in, but the truth was having her whole house back to herself was ultimately a good thing. Like, she felt relieved in some ways. But also there was a part of her that sort of missed having, her half-brother and Cassidy around. Especially when Kevin was, gone all the time working. Like, she just felt lonely. And also, on top of just being lonely, Tabitha often was the one saddled with childcare. They had a toddler and a 5-year-old, and, she was just sort of taking care of kids all the time, or sort of isolated. It was just exhausting. And now, as she watched Kevin back his car out of the driveway, she could tell today was going to be another long, exhausting, lonely day. That night, around 9 p.m., Tabitha was fast asleep on Kevin's bed with one of their sons when she felt somebody shaking her. And when she opened her eyes and looked up, she saw Kevin standing right over her. And he leaned down and he whispered to her that it was very late and that Tabitha should go to her bed out on the pull-out couch. And then he picked up their sleeping son and carried him off to the boys' bedroom without waiting for a response from Tabitha. As Tabitha got out of bed, she thought about just staying put and insisting on sleeping in the master bedroom that night. But, their kids were already asleep, and she also didn't want to risk getting into a fight with Kevin, especially at this hour, and waking everyone up. And so ultimately she decided against it and just left the bedroom and headed downstairs to the den. And then when she got there, Tabitha unfolded the pull-out couch and lay down, and she tried to fall asleep, but after tossing and turning for a while, she just pulled out her phone, and she pulled up the number for Keith, the guy she'd been having an affair with. As she did this, she reminded herself that she had promised to end things with Keith, but she was also feeling sort of desperate for someone to talk to, and Kevin was clearly very intentionally shutting her out, so after a moment, Tabitha hit the call button. Later that same night, around midnight, 911 operator Jacqueline Sanabria had just started her shift at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office when a call came in. Jacqueline answered it, and immediately this man's voice came over the line saying his wife had just been shot. And so right away, Jacqueline followed protocol, and as calm as she could, she asked the man, had he attempted CPR? And the man, in this eerily calm voice, said no, he hadn't. And the reason he gave was there was simply too much blood. At 1:45 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 2 hours after that 911 call, Sergeant Paul Sienna of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of a large white house with black shutters and an attached garage. There were a bunch of police cruisers and forensics vans that were already on the scene, and Sienna could see neighbors who were kind of coming outside, watching from their lawns and driveways, trying to figure out what was going on. Sienna had been very surprised when he had gotten the call from dispatch about a murder in Penfield, because Penfield was a really nice, safe area. In fact, there had not been a single murder there in more than 40 years. Now, he climbed out of his car and walked over to the front lawn where 3 deputies were interviewing this middle-aged man who looked like he might have just gotten out of bed. One of the deputies saw Sergeant Sienna, and so he ran over to him and began to brief him on what they knew. He explained to Sienna that the man they were speaking to was Kevin Bryant. He was the man who had called 911, and he was the husband of the victim, Tabitha Bryant. The deputy said that Tabitha and Kevin's 2 young sons had been inside the house at the time of the shooting, but their grandparents had picked them up a few minutes ago. The house itself had already been searched, and there were no signs of forced entry, but it was not hard to guess how the killer or killers got inside. The garage door had been left open, and then the door between the inside of the garage and the inside of the house had been left unlocked. So basically anybody off the street could have just waltzed into the house. Now, Sienna knew that in nice, safe neighborhoods like Penfield, it was not unusual for people to leave their doors and garage doors unlocked or even open. But at the same time, he did think it was a little unusual that it just so happened that on the night of the shooting, the house was unsecured. So he wasn't really sure what to make of that. At this point, Sienna glanced over at the husband, Kevin, and he saw Kevin suddenly bend over and start dry heaving. Now, Sienna definitely wanted to talk to Kevin, but really he needed to check out the crime scene first. And also considering how, Kevin did not appear to be ready to talk right now, he figured he should just go inside and have a look around. So he ducked under the police tape that was roping off the garage, and he made his way inside. Once inside the house, Sienna passed the kitchen and also a playroom, and they looked relatively normal. And then he got to the den, and there was nothing normal about the den. There was blood everywhere. On the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and there were all these forensic technicians that were inside of the den, furiously swabbing all over the room, trying to take samples of all this blood and also trying to photograph the entire scene. And in the middle of all this chaos happening in the den, Sienna saw the victim, Tabitha Bryant. She was laying on the pull-out couch bed. As Sienna walked over to the body to get a closer look, right away he saw this was not just a shooting, because Tabitha had, more than a dozen stab wounds to her chest and her neck. And then also right below her right eye, there was this small, clean hole that Sienna recognized as a gunshot wound. This was an excessive amount of violence, and it made Sienna think that this could have been a crime of passion. And the fact that Tabitha clearly had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den instead of in bed with her husband made Tabitha's husband, Kevin, Sienna's prime suspect. At 8:40 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 9 hours after Tabitha Bryant was killed, Sergeant Paul Sienna sat across from her husband, Kevin, at a diner in Rochester, New York. Now, normally, Sienna would conduct interviews like this at the sheriff's office, but he was starving after spending all night on his feet at the crime scene, and he also hoped that, this informal setting would hopefully get Kevin to be a bit more talkative. So Sienna was suspicious of Kevin, one, because he was the husband of the victim, and right away in murder cases, spouses are regarded as early suspects. And then also just this unusually violent murder. I mean, the murder itself was rare in a town like this, but it was just so violent, so much gore and blood. It just sort of screamed, this is a personal attack. This is a crime of passion. Again, making Kevin seem sort of suspicious here. However, the physical evidence made it look like Kevin actually could not have done it. He didn't have any blood or defensive injuries on him, which would make sense if he was the killer. I mean, given how much blood was at the scene, there should be some on him. And Sienna had checked the sinks and showers at the house to see if maybe Kevin had gotten blood on himself but cleaned himself up before police arrived. But there was no sign that there had been blood in the drains. Plus, the police had spent all night searching the house for murder weapons, a gun and maybe a knife, and so far they hadn't found anything. Still though, Sienna was not ready to, outright dismiss Kevin as a suspect, and he was looking for any holes in Kevin's story at this point. As Kevin had already explained multiple times by this point, he said he had come home from work around 9 p.m. the night before. He said he took the trash out, and then he went right up to his bedroom to read, while Tabitha was asleep on the pull-out couch downstairs. But at around 11:30 p.m., Kevin said he had gotten a very strange phone call. He had answered, and it was a woman, and she had said hello, but then it was silent, and there was just static on the line. Kevin eventually had just hung up and said he thought it was just a wrong number. But then he said a little while later, just before midnight, he'd heard gunshots and screams. Kevin said at that point he got up and he ran to his kids' bedrooms first to make sure they were safe, and when he saw they were, then he went downstairs and he found Tabitha dead in the den. And so now Sienna, sitting across from Kevin in their booth, he asked him, do you have any idea who could have done this? And Kevin, he paused for a moment, and then when he spoke, his voice cracked, and he actually began to cry as he sort of choked out that his wife's death was his fault. Now, at first, Sienna thought, oh my goodness, is this guy about to confess? Did he kill her? Is he going to tell me that? But when he pressed Kevin to continue, what do you mean by that? Kevin very tearfully would say that, he thought he maybe was the one who had left the garage open when he had taken out the trash, and he suspected that that must have been how the killer or killers got inside. And then, sort of oddly, Kevin continued and basically began to lay out this whole theory for what might have happened that night, sort of unprompted. He's giving his opinion. Kevin said, as he saw it, a burglar must have driven by, saw their garage was open, and decided to rob the house. However, he said when they went inside the house to rob it, they must have been caught off guard when they saw Tabitha in the den. And she must have woken up, and there must have been some sort of confrontation, and the burglar or burglars must have panicked and killed her and then fled without even robbing the place. That's probably what happened. And Sergeant Sienna did not give off how he felt about, what Kevin was doing and what he was saying. He just sort of nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering his theory. However, in reality, Sienna had already considered the possibility of this being a burglary gone wrong, but the way Tabitha had actually been killed just felt way too personal to chalk it up to a random intruder. And also, again, nothing from the house had been stolen. So what Sienna really wanted to know from Kevin was, why was Tabitha sleeping on the couch and not up with you? And to Sienna's surprise, Kevin was actually really open about these problems in their marriage. He explained that Tabitha was young, 20 years younger than he was, and she wanted to go to clubs and see friends every night of the week, while he was, usually too busy and too tired for doing that kind of stuff, so she would do it alone. Kevin said that once he'd realized his marriage was actually in trouble because of this dynamic, he said he'd put a lot of effort in to try to fix it by taking Tabitha out more often. And he'd thought things were basically back on track until a few months ago when he'd found out that she was actually having an affair. He said he'd drawn up divorce papers and been on the verge of filing them, but Tabitha had ultimately promised that she would break off the affair, so he had decided to give her one more chance. As Kevin said this, Sienna watched him very closely, trying to gauge whether or not Kevin was lying. Kevin definitely seemed nervous as he was speaking, and he also kept tapping his foot and running his fingers through his hair. But there was a chance that was also just exhaustion and maybe some shock, lingering shock. Sienna checked his watch and saw it was almost 9 o'clock, and he knew Kevin by this point had been awake for about 24 hours. But Sienna didn't want to just let him off the hook right now, because if Kevin was guilty, if he really did kill his wife or had something to do with it, Sienna knew he might never get a better shot at a confession than right now. So he decided he would just push Kevin to his breaking point and see if he'd crack. 8 hours later, around 4 p.m., Sienna stared at Kevin from across an interview room at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in downtown Rochester. Kevin was sort of slumped in his chair with his head buried in his hands, and he kept complaining about migraines. Now, Sienna was not surprised that Kevin might be feeling worn out right about now, because he'd been answering questions for the last 17 hours. And they'd covered everything from the details of Kevin and Tabitha's relationship to their extended families, including the fact that Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril, had lived with them for a few months earlier in the year and it had sort of ended badly. And by this point, Kevin had made it clear that he actually thought Keith Cromwell, the guy Tabitha had been cheating on him with, should be a suspect, and Sienna had to agree. However, what Sienna couldn't get over right now was just how angry Kevin sounded whenever he mentioned Keith. I mean, he was truly enraged. He clearly was not remotely over his wife's affair. And so now Sienna was trying to gauge if maybe Kevin was angry enough about this to have committed murder. And so Sienna decided he would push Kevin a little bit further and extend the interview, and he did this by suggesting that they go ahead and order dinner. And at that point, Kevin, who was totally mad, he jumped up out of his chair and he said that unless he was under arrest, he needed to go back to his kids. And Sienna did not have the evidence to hold Kevin, so he had no choice but to tell him that, of course, he was free to leave. And as Sienna watched a deputy escort Kevin out of the room, he felt a little disappointed that he had not managed to get a confession. But he had gotten some pretty promising leads. Primarily, there was Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril, who definitely sounded like he knew a lot about Kevin and Tabitha's relationship, and he could have some good insights. And also, Sienna was thinking, as soon as possible, he needed to speak to Keith, who was Tabitha's affair partner. At 10 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Sienna sat across from a broad-shouldered, bald, middle-aged man in the living room of a small house outside of Rochester. This was Keith Cromwell, the man that Tabitha had been having an affair with, and he struck Sienna as being a pretty tough, intense guy. So Sienna was actually a bit taken aback when he asked Keith about his affair with Tabitha, and Keith just began to cry. It just seemed sort of uncharacteristic for the way he appeared, at least at first glance. But Keith quickly wiped his eyes and he apologized, and then he asked what exactly Sienna wanted to know. And Sienna told him to just, start at the beginning. So Keith explained that he was a machine operator at a local factory, and it was a really stressful job. So Keith would sometimes blow off steam by going to a nearby strip club. And it was at that strip club about 6 months earlier that he had met Tabitha Bryant. And this really caught Sienna off guard, and he immediately asked Keith, what was Tabitha doing there at the strip club? But Keith just shrugged and said Tabitha had a wild side. She was a regular there. Sienna was still sort of taken aback by this and really didn't know what to think of it, but he just told Keith to keep telling his story. And so Keith continued, and he explained how he and Tabitha had exchanged numbers that first night, and then started texting and calling, and how that eventually turned into regular meetups when Kevin was at work. He said by July, they were hanging out several times a week and speaking on the phone basically every day. And Keith said this continued right up until Tabitha's death. And here, Sienna had to stop Keith again, because Kevin had told Sienna that Tabitha and Keith, their affair was over. But here Keith was basically telling Sienna the opposite. And so when Sienna pressed him on it, Keith said that actually Tabitha had called him around 11 p.m. on Sunday night, only about an hour before she was killed. And so this timing just felt like way too big of a coincidence, and it made Sienna wonder if Keith was actually just trying to give himself an alibi. Except it was not a very good one, because Keith lived close enough to Tabitha and Kevin that after that last phone call at about 11 o'clock, he would have had time to hang up the phone and drive over to their house and commit the murder by midnight. So this really wasn't an alibi. So now Sienna realized he was in a tough spot here. Tabitha's affair really gave both Kevin and Keith strong motives to want to kill her. And so basically neither man could be ruled out. They were kind of like equally primary suspects at this point. And on top of that, the additional information that Tabitha had been a regular at a strip club just raised a lot of additional questions. He realized he really needed to speak to someone who really knew Tabitha. Five days later, on July 19, 2003, Sergeant Sienna stood inside of a cemetery at the back of a group of mourners and watched as Tabitha Bryant's casket was lowered into the ground. Sienna had come to Tabitha's funeral not only to pay his respects, but also because he was looking for her half-brother, Cyril, and he had two reasons he really wanted to speak to him. First of all, he thought Cyril might have some additional unique insights into Tabitha's various relationships. I mean, Cyril had lived with Tabitha and Kevin and their kids earlier that year, and Sienna had heard that Cyril and Tabitha were quite close, and so maybe she had shared some additional insights that he would know. But the second reason for wanting to speak to Cyril was recently, Sienna had also begun to look at Cyril as being maybe a potential suspect. So Sienna had spoken with a number of Tabitha's friends, and from those interviews, Sienna had learned that Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy were also both regulars at that same strip club that Tabitha went to. And then on top of that, Sienna knew that, Cyril and Cassidy had been caught using drugs by Tabitha and Kevin, and that's why they had been booted from the house just a few months ago. And so who knows, there could be some bad blood there. And so this made Sienna wonder if Tabitha's murder might have had nothing to do with her affair, and everything to do with, very likely some fight that she had had with Cyril and Cassidy when she caught them and kicked them out. But now, as Sienna scanned the funeral crowd, he didn't see anybody who matched Cyril's description. And so when the service ended and all the mourners began making their way out to the parking lot, Sienna hustled over to Tabitha's mother, and he asked her, had Cyril attended the funeral? And she said that actually, no one had heard from Cyril since the night Tabitha was killed. And she said that she was really worried about him because Cyril's mental health was quite fragile. About a year earlier, he'd suffered a huge mental breakdown after the death of another sibling, which was why Tabitha had invited him to live with her in the first place. And so now Tabitha's mom was afraid that Cyril had spiraled again and might be in trouble. But as empathetic as Sienna was, ultimately, this information he was getting from the mother did not paint Cyril as like a guy in need of help. It painted Cyril as being really suspicious. And so, as politely as he could, Sienna asked the mom if she had any idea of how he could go about trying to find Cyril, any way he could even begin that process. And Tabitha's mom, she thought for a moment and then said that if anyone knew where Cyril was, it was his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. One night, about a week after Tabitha's funeral, Sergeant Sienna sat in the back of an unmarked van in downtown Rochester. And through the windshield, he watched a man standing alone in an alley, pacing back and forth, constantly checking his phone. This was all part of a sting operation that Sienna hoped would finally lead him to Tabitha's half-brother Cyril. Ever since Tabitha's funeral, he and his fellow deputies have been trying to track Cyril down, but so far they'd had no luck. It looked an awful lot like Cyril had either left town or was actively hiding from the police. However, Sienna had managed to locate Cyril's girlfriend, Cassidy, who, it would turn out, was well known to the police for being a drug dealer and an escort who went by the working name of Angel. Now, Sienna doubted that if he approached Cassidy directly, that she would just immediately give up Cyril's location willingly. And so what he needed to do was get leverage on her first. So Sienna went to an informant of his with a plan. The informant would reach out to Cassidy, or Angel, looking to buy some cocaine, and then once they had clear evidence that she had broken the law by selling these drugs, Sienna would arrest her and then try to strike a deal to get her to talk about Cyril. And so now, through a pair of binoculars, Sergeant Sienna watched as a small blonde woman appeared at the far end of the alley. His heartbeat picked up as he realized it was definitely Cassidy, and he watched as she walked right up the alley and began talking to the informant, the man who had been pacing before on his phone. And when Sienna saw the money and drugs change hands, he gave the command on his radio to go ahead and move in. In an instant, 2 police cars rounded the corner with their sirens blaring, cutting off both ends of the alley. Cassidy looked completely startled and started to run before the arriving deputies boxed her in, and moments later, they had her in handcuffs. The following morning, Sienna stood outside of an interview room at the sheriff's office in Rochester, New York. He looked through a two-way mirror, and on the other side of the glass, he watched a deputy question Cassidy, the girlfriend of Tabitha's half-brother Cyril, who was still missing and still a major suspect. Now, Cassidy had been completely stonewalling police since they'd arrested her for selling cocaine the night before, and she was still insisting that she had no idea where Cyril was or why he'd disappeared. Now, to this point, the deputy who was speaking to Cassidy had not brought up Tabitha's murder, And so at this point, Cassidy seemed to think that her only problem was the cocaine charge. And so as Sienna watched this interview just kind of go in circles and drag because Cassidy just was not giving them anything, finally Sienna just couldn't take it anymore, and he just busted in the room and he slammed a folder down right on the table, totally shocking not just the deputy, but Cassidy. They both looked at him like, "What are you doing?" And then before Cassidy could say or do anything, Sienna looked right at her and just said, "I don't care about your drug charge. What I want to know is what you know about Tabitha Bryant's murder." And at first, Cassidy just stared back at Sienna and said nothing. And for a minute, Sienna thought maybe he had sort of miscalculated here. But then after a long, awkward pause, Cassidy's whole demeanor shifted and she started to talk. Based on witness testimony, evidence collected at the crime scene, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Tabitha Bryant on the night of July 13th, 2003. Around 11:50 p.m., the killer very carefully crept through the first floor of the Bryant home carrying a rifle, and they went straight to the den, where they found Tabitha asleep on the pull-out couch. For a moment, the killer paused, just staring down at Tabitha, wondering, questioning whether they could really go through with this. But then, after just a little bit of deliberation in their own minds, they raised the rifle and they fired. The bullet entered Tabitha's skull right under her right eye, but it didn't kill her. And so as the killer is standing there watching, expecting Tabitha to basically be motionless, Tabitha wasn't. Her body began jerking around, and then she suddenly reached up and grabbed at her cheek, and she sat up and she looked at the killer and began to scream. And so the killer immediately fired 2 more times, but Tabitha was moving around so much in her own panic that both shots missed. And then on the 4th shot, when the killer pulled the trigger for the 4th time, the rifle jammed. And so at this point, the killer completely panicked. And so the killer turns and they run into the kitchen. All the while, Tabitha is flailing around in the den. She's screaming, blood's going everywhere. And the killer, they grab a butcher's knife from the kitchen. They run back into the den. And when they get there, they see Tabitha is now standing. And she's clutching at her face. She's screaming. And the killer tackles her back onto the bed and begins stabbing her over and over again in the neck and the chest until she does finally go limp. When the killer climbed off of Tabitha and stood back up, they realized they, like the rest of the room, were covered in blood. And so the killer began just sort of backing away from the scene, not really sure what they were going to do. And as they're doing this, they hear a noise behind them and they whip around and they see there was a figure coming down the stairs. And when this figure got to the bottom of the stairs, they walked right up to the killer and handed them an envelope. And the killer took the envelope, blood all over them. They take the envelope, they open it up, they look inside to confirm that yes, it was stuffed with $100 bills. It would turn out the person who actually wielded the rifle and the knife and literally killed Tabitha was her half-brother Cyril. He got covered in blood so that the real mastermind, Tabitha's husband, Kevin, could keep his hands clean. Kevin paid Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy $5,000 to do his dirty work for him. Cyril committed the murder, and Cassidy drove the getaway car. But long before they got to the house that night, Kevin was setting things up so that the murder would go according to his plan. Kevin opened the garage and unlocked the door to the house so that Cyril could come inside no problem. And when he found Tabitha in their bed upstairs, he woke her up and told her to head on down to the den, where he knew Cyril would look for her. Kevin was motivated by anger over Tabitha's affair with Keith, and also the fear that he would lose his kids if they got divorced. But ironically, it was actually Kevin's own actions that drove Tabitha, literally, into Keith's arms. Kevin portrayed himself as this, hard-working lawyer who basically was a workaholic, and all he did was provide for his family. But in reality, he was a drug and sex addict who routinely brought sex workers to his law office. His idea of working on his marriage, as he said he and Tabitha were doing after he discovered her affair, really just involved taking Tabitha to strip clubs and then pressuring her into having group sex with other sex workers. And then he would also pressure her to give lap dances to the other clientele. And one of those other clientele was Keith. That's how they met. Kevin and Cyril were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. As for Cassidy, she ultimately took a plea deal and received 15 years. Brittany Norwood was born in 1982 in Federal Way, Washington, which is a small city located about 20 miles south of Seattle. Growing up, Brittany's family never had much money. Her father, who was the primary breadwinner, ran a small upholstery shop in town, and while he worked tirelessly, he barely earned enough money to make ends meet. And considering how large Brittany's family was, she was one of 9 siblings, the lack of financial resources at times made life very challenging. However, Brittany's parents were not complainers, and they instilled in all of their children the importance of hard work regardless of circumstance. And clearly that message resonated with their children because by the time Brittany was a teenager, her older siblings had already gone on to become doctors, engineers, and management consultants. As for Brittany, she was just as ambitious as her older siblings, but her interests were in athletics. By the time she was in high school, she had become one of the very best soccer players in the entire state of Washington. She was so good, in fact, that by her senior year of high school in 2000, the best college soccer programs in America were actively recruiting her. She would finally settle on attending Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, because they offered her a fantastic scholarship and they were known for their excellent soccer program. Brittany was incredibly proud of her scholarship. It not only represented the hard work pays off motto that her parents had preached all of her life, but it also lifted a serious financial burden off of her parents. So in the fall of 2000, Brittany left Washington State and headed east to New York to begin her collegiate career. But right away, she struggled. Brittany had never left home before, and now she was suddenly 3,000 miles away from her family and her friends, and she missed them terribly. Within the first few days of being at her new school, she called her family and told them how much she missed them and how she kind of regretted coming to New York in the first place, but they reassured her that she had made the right choice, that these feelings were normal, and she just needed to give it some time. But despite taking her family's advice and sticking it out at Stony Brook, Brittany never really felt like she belonged there. She made friends, she got good grades, and performed well on the soccer team, but with every passing semester, Brittany became less and less connected to the school and the people there and just longed to be home. And so with that in mind, in 2003, so 3 years after she had arrived at Stony Brook, Brittany was at her school feeling down about her situation when she had a serious lapse in judgment. Brittany, who had never gotten in trouble in her life before, randomly stole one of her teammates' things out of their locker. She didn't even know why she did it. It just kind of happened, and then pretty much immediately she got caught. And as soon as she returned what she had taken. She felt horrible and she apologized, but the damage was done. The incident had already been reported to the school, and the school had a very strict code of conduct policy, which theft was in clear violation of. And so Brittany had her scholarship revoked, and without it, her family could no longer afford the school, and so she had to come back home. And when she got home, she felt like she had let her entire family down. And so for the next several years, the shadow of this huge mistake loomed over her like a dark cloud. She just kind of kept her head down and took part-time work here and there, but for the most part, while she was home, she was just sad and directionless. But finally, in 2010, so 7 years after coming home from school, when Brittany was now 28 years old, she decided enough was enough. She was going to stop letting this mistake define her life. She was going to go out and find a career and make something of her life, like her other siblings had. And the career move that seemed to make the most sense to her was becoming a personal trainer. Despite not playing soccer anymore, fitness was still a very big part of her life, and she loved the idea of helping other people get fit and stay fit. And so she began looking at where personal trainers were the most in demand, and she found Washington, D.C. was a total hotspot, and it just so happened 2 of her siblings were already living there. And so that year, she packed up her stuff and she headed out to D.C. as well. When she got there, she had a little cash, but not enough to sustain her longer than a month or two, so she applied for and got a job with a Lululemon shop. Lululemon is a company that sells yoga athletic apparel. The shop was located in Bethesda, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C., and right around the corner from the shop was a gym that Brittany immediately fell in love with and decided would be the perfect gym for her to run her personal training practice out of once she got certified. So a very happy and rejuvenated Brittany began work at the Lululemon shop in Bethesda in late 2010, fully expecting to only be there for a few months before she transitioned to her personal training career. At around the same time Brittany began working at the store, another young woman had started working there as well. Her name was Jana Murray, and she was quite similar to Brittany. She was 30, so 2 years older than Brittany, and she had been raised in a close-knit, modest household in Texas where her parents had preached always working hard and doing the right thing, and she really took that to heart. And like Brittany, Jana was also a star high school athlete, except instead of playing soccer, she was a big track and field star. And actually, she set some records in Texas for the discus throw. But after graduating high school, instead of pursuing athletics in college, Jana had pursued business. She enrolled in the business program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she worked in the private sector for a few years before deciding it made sense for her to go back to school to earn her master's degree in business. She was accepted to the very prestigious Johns Hopkins Business School, which was located a few miles from the Lululemon shop where Brittany worked. And by 2010, Jana was in her final semester, and all she had left to complete was a final thesis paper. A thesis is a long essay involving personal research. The assignment was to write about the structure of a company of her choosing. And since Jana was a huge fan of Lululemon apparel, she had decided to write about them. And during her research on Lululemon, she discovered that the company was far more than just clothing. They had what seemed to be a really cool company culture. All employees, no matter how junior, were encouraged to pursue whatever goals they had, even if their goals meant leaving Lululemon at some point. It was like the company fundamentally cared more about their people than their product. And Jana loved that. And so as she's writing this paper, on a whim, she decides to go get a job at a Lululemon store. And the nearest location was the one near her school. Jana figured working at this shop would only make it easier to finish her thesis, since it would provide her boots-on-the-ground information. Also, she just wanted to see for herself if this company was as amazing as it seemed to be. And so her plan was just to work at this shop until her thesis was done, at which point she'd earn her master's and more than likely she would quit and move on with her life. So in late 2010, when Brittany and Jana found themselves working at the same Lululemon shop in Bethesda, they were aware of each other, but really didn't know each other. Their only interactions were when their shifts happened to overlap, which did not happen very often. But when it did, they were perfectly nice to each other. They would chit-chat, but they were coworkers, not really friends. However, a terrifying event was about to link them together forever. On the evening of March 11th, 2011, Jana and Brittany were working together at the Lululemon. It was an uneventful shift. They chatted, they helped customers, and in between all of that, they would knock out whatever closing duties they were responsible for so that when closing time came, they could leave quickly. And then when it was closing time at 8 p.m., the pair did one last sweep of the store to make sure everything was neat and put away and locked, and then they both grabbed their things and headed out the front door. Once they were outside, Jana turned around and she pulled the keys out of her pocket and she locked the front door. And then Jana hopped in her car and she drove off. And Brittany, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the metro train station. But after only a few minutes of walking, Brittany swung her backpack off of her shoulder right in front of her, and she reached inside to fish around for her wallet because her metro train pass was inside of her wallet. And so she's fishing around her bag, she's still walking towards the train, and she can't find it. And so she comes to a full stop, she unzips her bag completely, and she looks inside, and her wallet is not in there. And as soon as she sees that it's missing, she remembers she left it on the break room table at the Lululemon store. And the only way she could go back and get her wallet was if Jana came back with the keys and unlocked the front door. And so Brittany just stood there for a minute wondering what she should do. She kind of felt bad about calling Jana to drive back and open the store for her, but she really needed her wallet for a whole bunch of reasons. And so finally, she picks up her cell phone and she calls Jana. And when Jana picks up, Brittany says, I'm really sorry, but I left my wallet in the store. Would you mind coming back and just opening the doors for me? I'll run in and I'll get it. Be super quick." And Jaina, surprisingly, was totally fine with this. She actually laughed and said, I left my laptop in the break room and I was going to get it tomorrow, but this is an excuse to go back and get it now. And so Jaina told Brittany she would be back at the front of the store in just a couple of minutes. And so Brittany thanked her, they hung up the phone, and then Brittany turned and she began running back towards Lululemon. When Brittany arrived at the front of the store, Jaina was already there, and Brittany immediately said, "I'm so sorry, thank you so much for coming back." And Jaina said, "Really, it's no big deal." And then Jaina pulled her key out and she opened the front door of the store and they stepped inside. The layout of this store was basically just a big square, where the front door entered the square right in the middle of it. So you step inside, you're in this kind of main shopping area. It's just this one square. And then all the way at the back, kind of lined up with the front door, behind the cash registers, was this employee-only hallway that went straight back about 7 or 8 feet. And then it reached this T intersection, where if you turned left, there would be another hallway that went straight for maybe 10 or 15 feet, and it would come to a dead end at a door, and that door would lead to a bathroom. And then if you were standing in front of that bathroom door and looked left, there would be another door that led into a very small kitchen. And then if you went back to the T intersection and turned right and looked straight ahead, you would see another stretch of hallway that was about 10 or 15 feet long, and it would look exactly like the left hallway, except at the end of the right hallway, there was no door to a bathroom. It was just kind of a dead end. But at the end of the right hallway, if you walked all the way down it and then turned right, you would see there was a door that led into the break room. So the break room and the kitchen were kind of oriented in the same position at either ends of each hallway. And so the two women go inside the store with Brittany in the front. They get inside, Jaina flips on the lights, and they walk across that square main shopping area. They go past the cash registers into that employee-only hallway. They go straight down, they turn right, they make their way down the right hallway, and then they open the door to the break room, and they go inside. Brittany very quickly found her wallet. It was on the table. She grabbed it. And so after she had her wallet, she just left the break room and began walking back out towards the main shopping area and the front door. Jaina was only a couple of seconds behind her. She grabbed her laptop and then she left the break room. She walked back down the hallway. And as she turned back into the main shopping area, she kind of had her head down. She was fiddling with her laptop and her phone. But even though she wasn't looking up, just looking down, she could tell right in front of her, Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the main shopping area. And so as soon as she saw that, she stopped what she was doing and she looked up. And immediately she could see why Brittany had come to a stop. There were now 2 men wearing all black with black ski masks on that were standing between them and the front door. The following morning, the Lululemon employee who was supposed to come in that morning and open the store and work that day, she turns onto the street that the shop is on and she begins walking towards the front door. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny morning. There are lots of people out going about their daily routines. And so this employee, she walks right up to the front door of the Lululemon. She's not really looking into the store. She's kind of got her head down and she fishes in her pocket. She pulls out her key that opens the front door. She slots it into the lock and she turns it to unlock it. And right away, she feels no resistance. The door was already unlocked. And so this really gets her attention and she looks up, but there's a glare on the glass from the sunlight, so she can't see inside. And so she just pulls the key out of the lock and then she pushes open the door and she takes a very tentative step inside. And right away she sees the entire store is destroyed. There are shelves knocked over, there's clothing everywhere, it's a complete mess. And before she can even process what she's seeing, she hears what sounds like moaning coming from the back of the store, basically back in those hallways. And so this employee is terrified, and instead of going in to investigate, she just turns around and leaves the store and immediately calls 911. And as she's on the phone with police, this man who just happened to be walking by at this moment, he saw her and saw how visibly upset she was. And so he just stood next to her and waited for her to get off the phone with the police. And then when she was, he asked her, what's going on? And she would explain that the door was unlocked, the store is a complete disaster, and I heard moaning inside and I'm too scared to go in. And so the man says, hey, I'm going to go in there and take a look around because I'm worried there could be someone who's hurt who needs our help right now before the police even get here. And so this man walks through the front door of the Lululemon, and right away, as soon as he steps in, he steps on broken glass and he looks up and the store is completely destroyed. Everything's knocked over. And he immediately hears the moaning coming from the back of the store. And so he very carefully starts walking straight ahead through the store, stepping over shelves that have been knocked down and trying hard not to destroy any merchandise that's on the ground. And when he reaches the back of the store, basically the entrance to this employee hallway that goes straight back, he hears the moaning, but he can't really tell which hallway it's coming from. And so he just calls out like, hey, who's back there? Do you need my help? But there was no reaction. And so he begins walking forward, and then he stops. He realizes the ground is slick. And so he looks down and he sees there's a very obvious blood trail from where he is standing straight back down this employee hallway. And the blood trail appears to turn right and kind of disappears out of sight down that right hallway. And so the man is terrified. He turns around and he looks towards the front of the store, kind of hoping that maybe the police or the paramedics would get there. But it's just the employee he had spoken to, and she looks terrified. And so the man decides, if there's someone hurt back here, I really need to go see what's wrong. And so very carefully, he begins walking down this initial hallway, following the blood trail. And then he turns right into that right hallway and he looks, and he can't believe what he is seeing. It looks like the entire right stretch of hallway was covered in blood. I mean, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, everything. There is blood everywhere. However, there's no person. It looks like all this blood kind of turns right and goes into the door at the end of the right hallway, the break room. And so this man knows, okay, obviously someone is very badly hurt, and whoever is moaning is almost certainly in that break room. And so he calls out again to see if this person will call back to him, but it's silent. And so he walks down this right hallway that's soaked in blood, and he gets to the end and he turns right and he grabs the handle of the break room door. He turns the handle and he pushes the door open. And at first he couldn't quite open it. There was something blocking the door from opening, but finally he kind of muscles it open enough that he can look inside, and he realizes what was blocking the door. There was a young woman lying face down on the ground, and her legs had been blocking the door. And this woman was Jaina. And this man, who was not medically trained, immediately understood this woman is deceased. The injuries she has sustained are so bad, there is absolutely no way she is alive. And he immediately thought, she also has likely been dead for some time. This does not look like it just happened. And so he's thinking, who's moaning? Where's the moaning coming from? Is there somebody else in this room? And so he pushes and kind of moves her body out of the way and sticks his head into the break room, and he scans around, but there's no one else in there. But as he's looking around, he hears the moaning again, and he realizes it's coming from the other side of the hallway, at the end of the left hallway. And so he shuts the break room door and he walks back up the hallway to the T intersection. And instead of turning and walking into the main shop, he continues down the left hallway. And he goes all the way down until he's standing in front of the door that leads into the bathroom, and to his left is the door that leads to that kitchen. And as he's standing there, he just kind of yells out, hey, whoever's in here, say something, because he doesn't know what door they're in. And he hears the moaning, and it's coming from the door right in front of him, the bathroom door. And so he opens the bathroom door, and immediately he's struck by all the blood all over the bathroom. And lying on her back on the ground is another young woman. It was Brittany. Her hands were zip tied together and attached to a pipe on the side of the room, and she was covered in blood. There were obvious stab wounds and slash marks and bruises all over her. And at first, this man assumed she must be deceased, and there must be a third person in this bathroom who's doing the moaning. But then he was startled when Brittany made this low, guttural moaning sound, almost like the sound of an animal dying. And he realized that was the moaning he was hearing. It was Brittany. At that moment, the police had arrived. They had rushed inside. They grabbed this man and escorted him out. They secured the scene, and then the paramedics came in, and they would confirm that unfortunately Jaina was deceased. And then when they went to Brittany, they found that she was still clinging to life. And so they put her up onto a stretcher and they began wheeling her out. And as she was being brought out of the store, the paramedics began trying to talk to her. And Brittany, amazingly, was able to say a few words. The police, who are also on the scene, they see this, and they're concerned that, she might pass away from her injuries before they get to talk to her. And so sensing she was able to talk, they kind of rushed over as she's being loaded into the ambulance out front, and they would say, hey, do you remember anything about what happened to you and the other woman who was in there? And Brittany was able to tell them that the night before there had been these two men who were wearing all black. They had ski masks on, so they didn't know what they looked like, and they had robbed the store, and then they had sexually assaulted both of the women but Jaina had apparently fought back so fiercely that they had killed her before they left. And so after she tells police this, the ambulance gets shut up and she's taken away to the hospital, and then the police immediately go into the Lululemon store to get the security footage from inside the shop to see if they can get some footage of the attack and see what happened. But unfortunately, the only camera this store had was on the exterior of the back of the building, just kind of looking out at a parking lot. There were no cameras looking in the store or at the front of the store. You have to remember, Bethesda, where the store was located, was considered to be extremely safe, very low crime neighborhood. And so more than likely, that was why this store did not have a security system. And so very frustrated, the police pulled up the only footage they could, which was this exterior camera. And sure enough, the night before, around midnight, the camera picked up two men wearing all black with their hoods up, running away from the store. And so there was really no way to identify who they were. All they could tell was, one was fairly tall. But nonetheless, they pulled the footage and they gave it to the media. And then that day and into the night, the local news played this footage on repeat, asking people in the area to come forward if they know who these two guys are. But by the next day, when the media and the police investigation had turned up nothing on these two guys, the police added a $150,000 reward for any information about who these two guys were. But after 48 hours since the discovery of this crime, still no one had come forward with any meaningful information about who these guys were, and so the police were kind of at a dead end. And so some of the detectives decided to go back to the Lululemon shop to walk the crime scene again to see if maybe something was missed in the initial search. And so the police, they come back to the shop, and it's being guarded 24/7 by police at this point. There's yellow crime scene tape outside blocking people off. And so the detectives arrive, they go underneath the yellow tape, they go past the security, they go inside, and then one of the detectives just walks straight to the back of the store and just kind of stands there near the registers looking around. And as he was looking around, he began looking at all of the bloody footprints that were on the ground. Now, by this point, all of the prints had been accounted for except for one set. There was a men's size 14 shoe print that had been spotted in several locations in the store, and it was just kind of assumed that it belonged to one of the killers. The thing about this print was that the treads of this shoe were fairly unique. They had a distinctive and fairly easy to recognize pattern to them. The police knew about this shoe print, but to be honest, they hadn't given it much thought because they felt like the print only seemed to confirm that a relatively tall man had been involved in this crime. But as this one detective stood in the back of the store and was just kind of looking around, he noticed a bin of shoes on the ground in the store. These shoes were there for shoppers to put them on when they were getting their pants hemmed and fitted to them. These shoes were not for sale. They were just kind of random shoes that were there effectively as props to make sure people's clothes fit properly. And the detective noticed one of the shoes at the top of the pile in this bin appeared to be a large men's shoe. And so purely out of curiosity, he reached down and he flipped the shoe over to look at the treads. And to his shock, they were an exact match to the unique treads on the size 14 bloody print. But the shoes he was holding were clean. There was no blood on them. So the detectives, they kind of all converge on the shoe, and they're thinking to themselves, did the attackers come in barefoot and perpetrate this attack with store shoes on and then afterwards clean them and leave them behind? Or is it just a crazy coincidence that one of the attackers happened to have the exact same style shoe and size as the one in this bin? They had no idea, but they felt like this was significant and they needed to get to the bottom of why this kind of random shoe in the store matched this print. And they thought the only person who might have more information about what the killer's shoes looked like would be Brittany. And so at this point, Brittany was still in very rough shape, but she had stabilized to the point where the police felt comfortable speaking to her. And so they paid her a visit and they asked her if she could remember anything about her attacker's feet. Did they wear shoes? And if so, what color were they? Anything she could remember at this point would be helpful. But Brittany would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember their feet at all. But there was something about the way she just very quickly dismissed the shoes that tipped the police off that maybe Brittany could be hiding something. But the police didn't press her because they knew she had just been in this horrific attack, and they also didn't really have a good sense of what her normal behavior looked like. So they just thanked her and they left. They were planning to speak to her again the following day, but she actually got in touch with them first and offered to have a meeting to go over what happened. And from the sound of her voice, it just sounded like she was just eager to help them. And so the police, they sat down with Brittany again, and they began talking about what happened and kind of going over the details. And they asked her again about the shoes. And again, she said she just didn't know. And then at some point in this second discussion they're having, Brittany kind of offhandedly mentioned something that she believes is just a small detail. But that small detail would ultimately be the thing that would lead police to figure out what actually happened on the night Jayna was killed. This is what happened. Back on March 11th, 2011, so the night of the attack, Jayna and Brittany were working in the store. It was a normal shift. Everything was fine. And then at closing time, they did their duties. They walked outside. Jayna locked the front door, and then they said their goodbyes and they went their separate ways. Jayna drove off in her car and Brittany began walking to the metro train station. But Brittany realized she had left her wallet in the break room, and so she called Jayna. And Jayna would tell Brittany that it was no big deal because she had left her laptop in the break room. Back at the front of the store, Jayna double parked her car out on the street, and then she and Brittany headed inside the shop. Brittany would lead the way to the break room at the end of the hallway on the right, and after she got her wallet, Brittany would turn around and leave the break room ahead of Jayna to make her way back out to the main shopping area. And so Jayna was only a few seconds behind Brittany. She was just getting her laptop, and then when she had it, she left the break room, she walked down the hallway, and she turned and began walking into the main shopping area as well. And she had her head down. She was just kind of fiddling with her phone and her laptop. But at some point, she realized, even without looking up, that Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the shopping area. So Jayna looks up, and there were not two men wearing all black with black ski masks blocking their way to the front door. In fact, there were no men involved in what happened next at all. The two men that had been seen on the security camera in the back of the building were just two cooks who happened to be hustling by the night of the attack and who happened to be wearing all black. It was just a coincidence. But there was someone standing in the store blocking Jayna from leaving. It was Brittany. Brittany was staring at Jayna, and in her hand was a foot-long square metal rod. It was one of the pieces of metal that normally was anchored into the walls of the store to hold up merchandise. Jayna is so caught off guard by this, she has no idea what the issue is. And so she says to Brittany, hey, calm down, we can talk about this. But Brittany was not trying to talk to Jayna. Brittany was trying to silence Jayna, and she had lied about her wallet to lure Jayna back to the store. This was a setup. Earlier that night, during their shift together, Jayna had caught Brittany stuffing a pair of yoga pants into her bag and had confronted her about it. And it's believed Brittany was worried Jayna was going to tell their boss about it the next day and that Brittany would be fired because of it. And then once again, her life would be derailed and she would be humiliated, and Brittany just couldn't have that. And so as Jayna slowly began to back up into the hallway with her hands up, trying to calm Brittany down, Brittany began to advance on her. And as soon as she did, Jayna screamed and turned and ran down that employee hallway. She turned right and bolted down the hallway towards the break room. She grabbed the break room door and she was trying to get it open, but before she could, Brittany had caught up to her and she smashed her over the head with the pipe. Immediately, Jayna turned around, she put her hands up over her head to protect herself, and she begged Brittany not to hit her again. But Brittany wasn't listening. Brittany just wound up and smashed her across the arms with the pipe. Jayna began screaming out and pleading with her to stop, but Brittany just kept on going. And for the next several minutes, Jayna just stood at the end of this hallway in front of the break room door, just trying desperately to protect herself with her hands. But Brittany was so strong and fast, and she kept striking her on her head and on the sides and anywhere else she could land a blow. The blood spatter on the walls of the end of that right hallway would later reveal that Jayna had gradually moved from a standing position down to the fetal position, meaning Brittany had literally beat her until she collapsed on the ground. And when Jayna hit the ground, she must have known she was trapped. There was no escape route for her, and she was so badly wounded that even if there was a way to go, Brittany was going to catch up to her and Brittany was going to stop her. And so Jayna just began quietly begging for her life. But Brittany had other plans for her. At the end of that right hallway that they were both in, Brittany had noticed a red toolbox was on the ground in the corner. And so around the time Jana had fallen to the ground and was begging for her life, Brittany dropped the metal pipe and she casually opened the toolbox, revealing screwdrivers, nails, wrenches, hammers, all sorts of tools. And one by one, Brittany began reaching into this toolbox, taking out a tool, and then smashing, cutting, slashing, and beating Jana with it. It would take Brittany roughly 10 minutes to cycle through every single tool in that toolbox. But shockingly, despite being dealt 330 significant wounds, Jana was still alive and she was still pleading for her life. Frustrated, Brittany stood up, she chucked the tools on the ground, she turned around and she walked down the hallway all the way to the kitchen at the other end of that left hallway. She went inside and she grabbed a large knife. Then she marched back into the hallway. She went straight down all the way to Jana. Jana is still begging for her life, and Brittany just reaches down. She grabs her hair with her left hand and pulls her head forward towards her. Then she takes the knife with her right hand. She raises it up and she brings it smashing down into the back of Jana's skull. The knife would pierce her skull, it would pierce her brain, and that would be the killing blow. Once Jana was deceased, Brittany simply got to work, staging the store to look like a robbery gone wrong. The first thing she did was drag Jana's body out of the hallway and into the break room. And then once the door was shut, she headed out to the front of the store and just walked straight outside and climbed into Jana's car that was still double parked outside. And she drove that around the block to a parking lot. And then when she got back inside of the shop, she went to that bin of shoes used for fitting pants. And she took out the size 14 men's shoe, she put them on her feet, and then she began walking around in the pool of blood underneath Jana in the right hallway and began tracking the bloody prints all over the store to make it appear like a man was involved in the attack. And then after cleaning the shoes, she ransacked the store, and then she grabbed a knife and a screwdriver and she headed into the bathroom where she repeatedly stabbed and slashed herself before tying her hands and her feet with zip ties. At 8 a.m. the next morning, she was discovered. The seemingly small piece of information that Brittany kind of accidentally gave to police during that second meeting, this piece of information that kind of broke the case, that came when the police asked her if she knew what kind of car Jana drove or if she'd ever been inside of Jana's car. And Brittany would say, "No, I don't know what it looks like and I've never been inside of it." But a couple of days later, when Jana's car would be found and the police would search it, they would find Brittany's hair and DNA all over it. So they knew Brittany had been lying to them. And so this is what ultimately led to Brittany's arrest, and she would later be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1938, a farmer in southeastern Australia decided to bring his horses to a watering hole on the other side of his large property. As he was leading the horses across this big, wide open field, one of his horses suddenly just collapsed to the ground. The farmer ran over to see what was going on, but as soon as he got over to it, the horse had stood back up again and seemed totally unhurt. The farmer was puzzled because he had no idea why the horse fell in the first place, and so he looked down to see if maybe it tripped on something, and he saw on the ground right beneath the horse was this small hole. And so he moved his horse out of the way, and then when he came back to look at this thing, he saw it was only maybe a foot across, but when he peered down into it, he saw it was very deep. And so he got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look, and when his eyes adjusted, he could not believe what he was seeing. 10 or 15 feet below the surface was this huge pool of clear water. The horse had just stepped into the roof of an underground cave. And so the farmer was really excited to see how big this cave was. And so he grabbed all his horses and he brought them back to the stable, and he got this long measuring rope with a weight at the end of it. So he runs back out to the hole, he puts the weight into the hole, and he begins paying out this rope. And so down it goes, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, it just keeps on going and going until finally the weight hits solid land at 120 feet. And so the farmer is like, wow, this is a huge cave. So he pulls it back up thinking that's the bottom, but in reality it wasn't. It actually extended down almost 300 additional feet. The farmer and his horse had just accidentally found one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world, called the Shaft. The reason it's called the Shaft is because the only way in or out of this underwater cave is through this hole in the middle of this field that this horse created, and it's literally a shaft that goes down 18 feet cave until it reaches the surface of this massive underground body of water. The opening to this shaft is so narrow that cave divers, they can't get into it with their gear on their backs. So they literally need to be lowered into this cave by themselves, and then their gear is lowered down after them, and they put it on while they're treading water. The solid ground that the farmer's weighted line had touched at 120 feet when he believed he had reached the bottom of the cave, what he had actually touched was the top of something called the rock pile. The rock pile is basically this huge underwater pyramid that looks like a rock pile that sits at the bottom in the middle of this huge underwater cave. And from the top of this rock pile, you can go down it in all different directions, but once you get to the bottom, there's only two tunnels to choose from. There's one that goes west, basically down at an angle that dead ends at 260 feet. And then on the other side of this underwater pyramid is the eastern tunnel, and that's much more treacherous. It goes down at a more steep angle to 400 feet. The few elite divers that have explored the deepest recesses of this cave say there are three distinct stages to it. Stage 1 is from the surface down to 120 feet, the top of the rock pile. During this stage, the diver swims unobstructed in beautiful clear water with sunlight poking through the hole. It's a very easy section of the cave. And there's a safety line that's anchored from the surface straight down to the top of the rock pile. So you have something to hold on to as you go down and back up. Stage 2 is where things get a bit dicey. Stage 2 begins at the top of the rock pile and extends down all the way to the bottom of the westerly tunnel at 260 feet where it dead ends, or down to the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel where you come to something called the drop-off ledge. And it's quite literally a ledge in the middle of this tunnel where beyond it there's a fairly steep drop-off, and it leads down to an area that's so treacherous it's got its own stage. Starting with stage 2 and then with stage 3, there is no safety line to guide you in the direction you need to go. So you're on your own as soon as you reach the top of the rock pile. And so you make your way down any direction you want down the rock pile until you reach either of these tunnels. And as soon as you go into them, you immediately start to lose visibility because the sunlight cannot penetrate all the way into these tunnels. And so the diver becomes increasingly reliant on their flashlight. As such, they have to be very careful as they navigate down stage 2 to not bump into the walls, because doing so will knock the limestone silt off of the walls. It will create a cloud of it in their face. It will blind them. It's like being in fog where a flashlight can't push through it. And so the diver has to either wait for the silt to clear, which could take a very long time, or they have to swim blind. Also, anyone entering stage 2 and stage 3, they can't breathe regular air out of their tanks. There's too much nitrogen in regular air. The deeper you dive, the more nitrogen your body will absorb, and if you have too much nitrogen in your system, it can give you something called nitrogen narcosis, which is like being really drunk. And in extreme cases, people have been known to take their mouthpiece out and inhale water, believing they're on the surface, or they'll confuse the direction up with the direction down, and to get to the surface, they will swim straight down until it's too late and they can't get back up again. And so divers that are going to be in stage 2 or stage 3 of this cave will breathe a special mix of gases that are low in nitrogen. The final stage of the shaft, stage 3, is just from the 200-foot mark of the easterly cave, so that drop-off ledge, all the way down to the bottom at 400 feet. This stage is unbelievably dangerous. As soon as you drop off that ledge, all the sunlight goes away. It is pitch black, and the tunnel narrows considerably and stays incredibly narrow. In fact, many times divers have to squeeze themselves past sections where the rocks are too close together. And so because you're inherently bumping into the walls all through stage 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to be silted out the entire time. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed, even if you're breathing a special low nitrogen mix of gases. And so divers need to be ready to abort the dive at any moment if they feel symptoms coming on. Once the diver has turned around and is making their return trip, but they're still in the third stage section of the cave, they need to be careful of false domes. These are offshoots on the ceiling only in this third stage that look like the way out. And especially when things are silted out and it's dark, you're low on oxygen, you might be panicking, it'd be very easy to confuse these with the way out. But in fact, these false domes are exactly what their name implies. They are false. They are dead ends. They go nowhere. Stage 3 is reserved exclusively for extremely experienced cave divers who get special permission. In 1973, 8 divers got permission to dive the first and second stages of the shaft cave. They did not get permission to dive the third stage of the cave. On May 28th of that year, the 8 divers arrived in that big open field near the cave opening and began prepping their gear. Their plan was to dive down all the way to the edge of the drop-off ledge, so looking into the third stage, and then once they got there, look around for a minute and then turn around and head back up to the surface. These 8 divers were experienced divers, but their experience was all in open water environments. None of them had dove in a cave. And so they were confident divers, but they were a little bit naive. They believed the dive down to the edge of the third stage was going to be fairly routine and would just be simple and fun. But before any of them had even gotten into the water, they had already made a critical mistake. Instead of jamming their bottle with the special low nitrogen mixed gas that they would need since they were going into stage 2, and so that's a requirement, instead of doing that, they just jammed their bottles with regular air. So they were basically guaranteeing that they would get nitrogen narcosis. But once they had all their gear prepped, they made their way over to the entrance to the shaft, and one by one they were lowered down into the water and their gear would follow. And then once all of them were all jocked up, they grabbed the safety line and they began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes to get down to the top of the rock pile, and there they spent about 5 minutes taking pictures of each other before heading down the eastern tunnel. 3 of the divers were siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine, who were 25, 22, and 19 respectively. And Glenn remembers after they made their way all the way down the eastern tunnel and they reached the drop-off ledge, he remembers seeing his sister, his brother, and all the other divers. Everyone seemed just fine. Everyone's just looking over this ledge. They're taking turns, kind of peering down into this black abyss that is stage 3. And then after 5 minutes or so, Glenn looked at his gauge and he saw his air was getting fairly low. Not emergency situation, but it was time to leave, and everybody else had the same amount of air as he did, and so everybody else was running low on air. And so Glenn was about to grab his sister, who was several feet right in front of him. She was still looking over the ledge down into stage 3, but when he reached out to grab her, she and all the other divers just suddenly jumped forward and dove straight down into the abyss out of sight. They dove into the stage 3 section. This was not something that Glenn was tracking anybody doing. This was not something anyone said they were going to do. This was not part of the dive. This was very dangerous, and they weren't allowed to go down there. And so Glenn immediately swam down after them to try to grab his sister and stop her, or grab his brother, or grab any of them. But as soon as he went over that ledge, he saw it was totally pitch black and it was completely silted out from all these divers suddenly launching over the edge. And so Glenn knows he's not going to find them in the silt. It's also very dangerous for him alone to just dive down there. And so he figures, you know what, I'm sure they're fine. They probably planned this out and they're just going to go down a little ways and they'll come back up again. And so I'll just go to the rock pile and wait for them. And so Glenn turns around and he goes up back over the drop-off ledge. He makes his way to the rock pile and he just sits there facing the eastern tunnel, waiting for his brother, his sister, and the other divers to come back out again. But they don't. And finally, his air gauge gets so low that he literally has to go to the surface. And he's thinking to himself, if my air is this low, what are they doing down there? 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers that went with Glenn's sister and brother and the other 2 divers into this forbidden third stage section of the cave. Although he doesn't say this, it sounded like he and the others just wanted to go a little ways into this off-limit section, check it out, and then turn around and go back to the surface. And so Larry would say, as soon as they went over the ledge and they're in this third stage, it went completely pitch black and the tunnel immediately constricted dramatically. And so as they're going down this very tight and pitch black tunnel, they reach a section that's so tight, they're down on their stomachs, literally pulling themselves through. And so after a few minutes of the group forcing themselves into this unbelievably dangerous place, it's like they all collectively realized, this is a terrible idea, we need to turn back. And so as they all began turning around, they realized their return trip just back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only maybe 25 feet, was completely silted out. And so Larry is in the back of this return trip line, and right in front of him is Christine. And so as soon as they all make their way into the silt, the only thing Larry can see with his flashlight is Christine's fins. And so he's staying right up on her and keeping his light on that fin to make sure he's going in the right direction. And so after only a few moments, Christine's fins just suddenly disappear. And so Larry's thinking, I don't know where she went, but I don't have enough time. I have almost no air. And so he just keeps on swimming, believing he's going the right way. And sure enough, he clears out of the silt and he goes up and back over the drop-off ledge, and he shines his light back up the eastern tunnel, back up towards the rock pile, expecting to see Christine and the other divers he was just with. But he's looking and there's no one there. There's no silt. It's totally clear. And there's not one diver in front of him. And so he looks at his gauge again and he's got a little bit of air, enough to maybe go down and make sure nobody is still down there. Because he's thinking, I don't think it's possible they could have swam all the way through this tunnel in this space of time. So he turns around, he goes back over the drop-off ledge, back into the silt, and as he's moving very slowly and cautiously, up ahead he sees flashlights moving around on the ceiling of the tunnel. And so he moves down towards this flashing light, and he realizes the light is coming from inside of a false dome right above him. And so he looks up, and he saw there was Christine and another man named Roberts, who was 28, frantically swimming around, shining their lights, looking for the way out, not realizing they're in this dead end. And so Larry was about to shine his light to get their attention when Larry's flashlight went out. And so now Larry is in complete darkness. He is completely silted out. He doesn't even know how much air he has left because he can't shine the light on it. And so he's starting to panic. He starts banging on his flashlight, and finally the light comes back on. And when it does, he shines it straight up again to try to shine it towards Christine and Roberts, but he had drifted farther down the tunnel. And so by the time he shined his light, he wasn't underneath the false dome. But when he shined his light in the other direction, he saw he was at the very far end of where the group had gone. And so farther down into stage 3 was clear. There was no silt. And so he shined his light down into the stage 3 tunnel, and way down the tunnel, barely visible, he sees there is one diver with his flashlight out swimming the wrong direction down into oblivion. His name was John, he was 20 years old, and he almost certainly had nitrogen narcosis. Larry knew he could not save him, and so Larry turned around and went back into the silt, back up in the direction of the rock pile, touching the ceiling, looking for that entrance into the false dome to try to help Christine and Roberts. But he's not finding it, and he's looking at his air gauge, and it's getting critically low, and he knows if he doesn't go soon, he's gonna die. And so at some point, after not finding the entrance to this false dome, he decides he just has to go out and save himself. And so he manages to get out of the silt. He goes up and over the drop-off ledge. He gets to the rock pile. He grabs the safety line and he fins himself up to the surface. And when he gets to the surface, he looks around and there's only 3 other divers up there, one of which is Glenn. And Glenn, he looks visibly panicked and he yells to Larry, "Hey, have you seen my brother and my sister? Have you seen the others? Are they coming up after you?" And Larry looks at him and just shakes his head. He didn't know what to say. He knew they were gone. But for Glenn, this was his baby brother, his baby sister. He had to go back down. And so with the little bit of air he had left, he put his mouthpiece in, he turned around and he dove straight down as fast as he could, staring towards the opening of the eastern tunnel, praying that his family members, that his friends are going to come out of there. But as he's swimming down and he's running out of air, no one was coming out of that tunnel. And so finally, when his air was basically empty, he had to turn around. And on that return trip back to the surface, he realized his siblings and his 2 friends were gone. It would take 11 months and 11 days to finally locate and recover all 4 of the bodies inside of the cave. John, the 20-year-old who Larry saw swimming in the wrong direction, was found fairly far down the eastern tunnel, laying on a rocky outcropping. Glenn's 22-year-old brother, Stephen, was found just 50 feet from the entrance of the shaft, but it's believed he died at a much lower depth and then floated up to that position. Glenn's 19-year-old sister, Christine, and the 28-year-old man, Roberts, that she was with inside of the false dome were found embracing each other just under the false dome inside of the tunnel. Investigators believe when they were in there, they couldn't find the exit and then realized that they had so little air that even if they found the exit, they would not get out in time. And so knowing they were just minutes away from death, they abandoned looking for the exit and instead just embraced each other while they died. And then afterwards, they floated down and out of the false dome. After this tragedy, the shaft was permanently closed to all divers, but years later, they would reopen it. So that... In 2015, 29-year-old Johnny Coxey and his wife, 25-year-old Megan Coxey, were living in a low-income section of Spartanburg, South Carolina. They both struggled mightily with drug addiction to the point where it was nearly impossible to get steady work, and so they often found themselves out on the streets begging for money. Their addictions also made it nearly impossible to be a good parent to their only child. And in fact, in December of that year, Child Protective Services stepped in and took their child away from them. And if that wasn't bad enough, almost immediately after their child was taken from them, both Megan and Johnny were arrested and thrown in jail for various offenses that were connected to their drug habits. So Johnny and Megan are at absolute rock bottom at this point as they're sitting in jail, but they were about to get a big break. After they both got out of jail, they were only in jail for a couple of days, Megan was contacted by a local, very successful real estate agent named Todd Kohlhepp. Todd was someone she had met previously when she used to be a waitress at a local diner, and Todd was reaching out to her to somewhat unbelievably offer her and her husband pretty decent paying jobs. Apparently, Todd had recently purchased this massive 95-acre plot of land in the area, and he needed people to come onto the property and help clean it up and clear brush and clean some of the buildings that are on there, because his plan was to further develop this property. And so he had been reaching out to other people in Spartanburg to see if they were interested, and Megan and her husband were two people he had contacted. And so, of course, Megan and Johnny say, yes, we would love to do this job. They were in desperate need of cash, and paying jobs did not come around very often. So on December 19th of that year, Megan spoke to her mother and told her about this job opportunity and where it was and what she'd be doing. And then she and Johnny made their way out to this property. And when they got there, they saw this huge chain link fence wrapped around what seemed like a massive forest. And this forest was the 95-acre plot of land that Todd owned. And so apparently at the center of this forest were a few buildings that Johnny and Megan would be responsible for cleaning. And so they made their way down the fence line until they found the break in the fence, and that led to an access road, and they began driving down it deep into the heart of this forest. 3 days later, Megan's mother tried to get in touch with her, but she couldn't. And when she reached out to Johnny, she couldn't get in touch with him either. And so given the couple's history with drugs, Megan's mother thought the worst, that, maybe they overdosed. And so she panics and she rushes to Megan and Johnny's house. They're not there. And so something in her gut tells her that something is wrong here. It's not common for them to just completely go off the grid. And so she called the police. The police began their investigation by speaking to Todd Kohlhepp, who was the owner of this property, because presumably he was one of the last people to see them before they went missing. But when they spoke to Todd, he said, look, I had limited interaction with them. They were on my property. They came out, they cleaned these two buildings on my property, and then I paid them and they left. And we haven't had any contact since. So, unfortunately, I don't have a clue where they would have gone next. And so at this point, the police decide their best bet is just to wait and see what happens. Although they did not tell Johnny or Megan's families this, the police force did have a running suspicion that, it was possible, if not likely, that the couple had used the money from cleaning up this property to go buy drugs, and then they went on a drug binge, and they would either turn up in a couple of days alive or dead from an overdose. But a couple of days went by, and the couple did not reemerge, and no one had any idea where they were. And then a couple of weeks went by, and then a couple of months went by, and it wasn't long before the case went cold. But it would not stay cold for very long. On August 31st, 2016, so roughly 8 months after the Coxeys were reported missing, 2 more residents of Spartanburg went missing as well. They were 30-year-old Kayla Brown and her boyfriend, 32-year-old Charlie Carver. The pair had only been dating for about a month, but they were becoming quite serious, with Charlie already introducing Kayla to his family, a step that Charlie's father said was a very big deal for him. Unlike the Coxeys, Kayla and Charlie were not struggling with drug addiction or with financial issues. They were actually pretty well off. Charlie worked full-time operating a printer at a local business, and Kayla made a living by doing odd jobs around town. According to their families, it seemed like the couple was very happy with their lives and the directions they were going. But starting on the evening of August 31st, Kayla and Charlie stopped returning text messages or answering phone calls. Charlie's father was especially close with Charlie, and so this sudden silence was immediately noticed by him, but he kind of ruled it out and thought, you know what, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for why he's not texting me back, and so, I'll hear from him over the next couple of days. But over the next couple of days, Charlie continued not to answer text messages or pick up phone calls, same with Kayla, and so after 48 hours of this total silence, Charlie's father finally hopped in his car and drove to his son's house to see if he was there, and he wasn't. And then he drove to Kayla's place, and she wasn't there either. And so none of it made any sense, and so he called the police and he reported them missing. The police started with absolutely no leads, and so what they did to begin their investigation was basically just to interview everybody in Charlie and Kayla's life. Friends, family, acquaintances, employers, co-workers, everyone, but no one had any idea where this couple had gone to. They had not told anyone about some trip they were going on or something they were going to do. It just seemed like they had vanished. And so initially, this investigation really got nowhere. But 2 months after they had been reported missing, the police finally obtained a search warrant that would allow them to look at their respective cell phone records. And when they looked at Kayla's cell phone records, they were able to triangulate roughly where her last known location was, according to pings her cell phone was sending off to nearby cell phone towers. And they discovered her last known location, at least of her cell phone, was inside of the same 95-acre plot of land that the Coxies had been in before they went missing. And so immediately the police put in for a search warrant to go search this 95-acre property, and they sent a team actually out to the property, and they actually set up outside of that big fence and just waited for the search warrant to clear. And at the same time, another group of police officers went to Todd Kohlhepp's house, which was actually in town about 20 minutes away from this property, to talk to him about why in the world Kayla's cell phone would be pinging inside of his property. And so when the police arrive at his front doorstep, Todd is obviously caught off guard by suddenly there being all these police officers. And he does understand very quickly how unbelievably suspicious it looks that now you have potentially two couples that have gone onto his property right before they vanished. And so he says to them, look, I know how this looks, but I gotta tell you, I did hire Kayla and her boyfriend did come along with her. She went onto my property. She did some work for me. She cleaned up some stuff, cleared some brush, and then I paid them and then they left. That is the last I saw of them. I have no idea why her phone would be on my property. At the same time, the team of police officers were kind of grilling Todd at his house. The other team that was outside of the 95-acre property, they found out their search warrant had been granted. And so they flew through the gate, they got on that access road, and they began bombing into this huge forest. And as they're driving, they pull out their maps they had printed out that showed the rough estimation of where her final location was within this property. And it looked like the last spot was inside of a clearing. And so as they're driving down this access road through all these trees, they see up ahead, there is a clearing, and it looks very much like the clearing on their map where this final location is. And when they pull into the clearing, off to the left side of the road are these two green buildings. The left building was like a shed, like something you might keep yard tools in, like lawnmowers and shovels and rakes, that kind of thing. And then right next to it on the right was this metal shipping container, and it had all these metal chains and 5 padlocks keeping it shut. Now, of course, the police are thinking, oh my goodness, is Kayla inside one of these buildings? Because this is probably where her last location was. And so right away, the police went inside of the left building, the shack, because it was easier to get into. There weren't padlocks all over it. And when they got inside, there really was nothing of note. Kayla was not in there. Charlie was not in there. There was no cell phone in there. It was just gardening tools. And so they went over to the right building, the shipping container, and they got out their metal cutting saws and their bolt cutters, and they began cutting into all of these locks and chains. And when they finally got that door open, they were absolutely astounded at what they saw inside.
Get right up on it. Get right up on it. Yes. Pull that one first. All right, let them get ready. Y'all ready? Come on, guys. It's jammed in here. Give me that crowbar back. Where's that? Get that big crowbar here. Right here. John. Put it down here. Yeah, there you go. Watch out. Y'all move. I got it. Watch out, boss.
Hey, Joey.
Sheriff's officer.
Sheriff's officer.
What?
Grab that
Back up there,
camera.
buddy.
Just one. Are you okay?
Grab what? Go.
Do you have any weapons? Coming through, okay?
What's your name? What's your name, man?
Right here.
Lauren. Okay. All right.
Just a girl.
Just a girl. Just a girl. How are you, honey?
This is
bolt
cutters.
This is our best. He's a paramedic.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we're gonna get you out of there. Okay.
Just hang loose for me.
Anybody got? I need a handcuff key.
The police had just discovered Kayla. She was in rough shape and she had a metal chain wrapped around her neck that was anchored to the wall and she was handcuffed, but she was alive. And after they cut her free and got her out of the shipping container, she told them what happened. She said back on August 31st, 2016, so this was the same day that Charlie's father had realized his son was not responding to his text messages, and when he was calling Kayla, she wasn't answering either. So on that day, Kayla says she was contacted by a friend of hers, Todd Colehep, and he told her that he was still looking for people to come out and help clean up the property because he was getting ready to develop it. And so Kayla, she was looking for work, and so she agreed to do it. And after getting this job, Kayla would tell Charlie, and Charlie, just being a good boyfriend, said, you know what, I'll tag along with you and I'll help you do this job. I won't ask Todd for any money. I'm just gonna go and help you. And so Kayla was totally thrilled about this. And so later that day, she and Charlie, they made their way out to the 95-acre property. They reached that fence that kind of borders the entire property. They followed it until they hit that break in the fence. They hopped on the access road and they began driving into the heart of this very thick forest. And after driving for several minutes, they reached this clearing. And in this clearing, they see Todd up ahead on the left. He's smiling and waving at them. And he's standing in front of the shack and the metal shipping container. And so Charlie pulls the car in right in front of Todd. And then Charlie and Kayla, they get out. They walk up to Todd to, see what he needs, see what he wants them to do. And as soon as the couple is standing in front of Todd, Todd just casually pulls out a gun and shoots Charlie 3 times in the chest. And as soon as Charlie falls to the ground, Todd aims the gun at Kayla and says, if you go anywhere, I will kill you and I will kill your family. And then he put the gun away, walked over to Charlie, and he wrapped him up in a blue tarp, and then he carried his lifeless body and dumped him in the nearby bucket of a tractor. And then Todd just walked back over to Kayla, who's witnessed this entire thing. She is so terrified she can't even move, and she's just staring at Todd. And Todd draws his gun again at her and orders her to go into the shipping container. So he brings her inside, he locks her up, and for 65 days, she would remain his prisoner. And over the course of those 65 days, Todd would once or twice a day come down and do whatever he wanted with her. And he told her at the outset that if she ever tried to resist him in any way and didn't do whatever he wanted with her, he would not only kill her, he would also kill her family. And so Kayla very early on decided she would not put up a fight. She just kind of accepted that this was her life, that she would be horribly mistreated, and then probably at some point he would grow tired of her and kill her, but at least she would be sparing her family. And so when the police finally went into that shipping container, Kayla truly did not expect ever to be rescued. So when you watch that video, you need to understand that was someone who believed she was 100% going to die inside of that space. And so after Kayla tells the police officers this totally horrible and traumatic story, they immediately radio over to the other team of police officers that were still at Todd Colehep's residence, still talking to him, and they tell them, hey, this is what Kayla just told us. Todd's reaction to this news was also captured on video.
We have Kayla. Excuse me. We have Kayla in your property. She was locked in a container. Okay? She has told us that you shot and killed Charlie. Why did you shoot him?
I didn't shoot anybody, sir.
Okay, why did you lock her in a container in your property?
I don't stop.
She's on your property right now, locked in a container. She's saying you buried Charlie's body on that property.
No, sir.
So you're saying you didn't lock her up, you didn't put her in the Connex box or anything?
No, sir. I'm money an attorney.
Probably a good thing. Go ahead and put him in the back of your car.
Even though Todd would initially deny any wrongdoing and would claim he had nothing to do with what happened to Kayla or Charlie, he would eventually confess not only to killing Charlie and kidnapping Kayla, but also to killing Johnny and Megan Coxey. Apparently, he had done to them what he did to Kayla and Charlie. He had lured the Coxeys onto his property on the promise of work, and then when they reached those two structures, he drew a gun and he shot Johnny and killed him, and then he ordered Megan to go inside of the shipping container. Now, unlike Kayla, who would ultimately comply, and it did save her life, Megan did not. She fought back. She was totally resistant. She wouldn't do anything that he wanted her to do. And so after only 5 days of her being in captivity, he would kill her. And the way he would describe her was, oh, you know, she was acting like a wild animal, so I had to put a bullet in the back of her head. He didn't care at all about these people he had killed. Charlie, Johnny, and Megan's bodies would all be discovered in shallow graves right outside of that shipping container. Knowing he was potentially facing the death penalty and wanting to avoid that, Todd told police after he had confessed to these murders that he could actually confess to even more murders, and if he did, could they take the death penalty off the table? And so the police ultimately would agree, and Todd would tell them that back in 2003, he had walked into a motorbike shop and killed 4 of their staff members. Apparently, a couple of days earlier, they had offended him in some way. He had gone in there and they had kind of made some snide remark about how he was bad at riding motorcycles. It was kind of in good fun. It was not meant to be very mean, but Todd had taken it as an absolute offense and he could not stand for it. And so literally in broad daylight, he had walked back into this store and gunned all of them down. And then once they were all down, he had walked by each of them and put an additional round into each of their heads. And so as Todd is telling the police this terrible story, he's totally nonchalant about it. He's laughing about it, and he's even bragging to police that they would be proud of him at how quickly he cleared the superbike shop, meaning how quickly he got in there and killed everyone inside. That somehow, because police officers use weapons too, they would appreciate how efficient he was. These 4 murders would be the only additional murders Todd would confess to, and they would be enough to take the death penalty off the table. But it's believed Todd had killed more people. In fact, he had blatantly admitted to Kayla when she was in captivity that his body count was in the high 2 digits. And most likely he was telling her this because he planned on killing her before she could ever escape and tell anyone. But of course, she was rescued, and so the world now knows. However, if Todd never confesses to any more murders, there's a very good chance we'll never know about them. One of the more disturbing aspects of this case is after it became public that Todd Kohlhepp was the killer, someone discovered that an anonymous account was doing all these product reviews on Amazon, and this anonymous account was Todd Kohlhepp. And the products he was reviewing were things like knives and shovels and chainsaws, and the reviews literally were about how he planned on using these tools to kill people, or they were how he had used these tools to kill people, or how he had disposed of bodies. And then there was also a couple of reviews of padlocks, and one of the reviews said he had 5 of them on a shipping container, and so now the shipping container was just like Hotel California. Hotel California is the famous song by the band The Eagles, and in this song, the famous line is, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." Todd was ultimately sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, which means he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. So that's... After numerous reports that LaToya Ammons was mistreating her children, based on reports that she gave, she was telling police that demons were throwing her kids around the house. Based on those reports, Child Protective Services was sent to do a home study, to go to their house, go to LaToya Ammons' house, and make sure it was a safe, clean place for children to be living. In addition to the case manager, her name was Valerie Washington, who was going to be going over to do this home study, the Lake County Sheriff Department also sent over Lieutenant Gruszka, who would be assisting Valerie and watching the home study take place. When Gruszka arrives at the house, he is met with Valerie Washington, also LaToya Ammons, the mother, and her 2 sons, Andrew, who's 9, and Amante, who's 7, as well as LaToya's mother, so the boy's grandmother. Her name was Rosa. Washington, the case manager, pulls Gruszka aside out of earshot of LaToya and her family, and she starts telling Gruszka about what happened at the hospital 8 days earlier, because she, the case manager, had already begun investigating LaToya Ammons and that whole situation with her kids. 8 days earlier, Washington was at the hospital, sitting in a waiting room Washington was with a psychologist, and they were speaking to Rosa, who was the grandmother of these children. In the room was also Andrew, the oldest son, and Amante, the youngest son. And as they're chatting, Amante, the youngest son, stands up and walks to the middle of the waiting room. And his eyes roll back into his skull, and he begins emitting this growling sound that sounded too deep for a boy of 7 years old. The grandmother reacted to it like she had seen it before. She got right up, she marched over to him, and she took him by the hands, and she yelled, "You are not you." And she kept saying that, and the boy's eyes are still back in his head, and he's not responding to anything his grandmother's saying. As Rosa is repeating over and over again, "You are not you," Amante begins backpedaling towards a wall behind him. And Rosa holds his hands the whole time. She's holding his hands firmly. He gets to the wall, and instead of stopping, he puts his foot up against the wall. This is a 7-year-old boy, and begins walking up the wall by pressing against Rosa. And she's holding on tight, and he's pressing back at her and using that weight to walk backwards up the wall. The psychologist in Washington are just watching in disbelief. Rosa's holding on to him as he walks all the way up to where he's on his tippy toes on the wall. And then he flips forward in front of her and lands on his feet on the other side of Rosa. The psychologist and Washington literally run out of the room, and they go get a doctor, and they explain what happened. The doctor comes in, not having any clue what to make of this, and just says to the boy, "Can you do that again?" And Amante at this point, his eyes are back to normal, and he's sitting now next to Rosa, and he says, "What? I didn't do anything," and acted like he had not been walking up the walls. Now, it's not in the report how Lieutenant Gruszka responds to Washington's story about the hospital. However, the entire police report that I'm pulling all this information from is written by Lieutenant Gruszka at the end of the investigation. So this exchange between he and the case manager, Washington, about the hospital visit that he was not part of, it apparently carried weight in the entire investigation, that he felt compelled to add it into the report. Even though on paper, you would think if you're doing a home study for this house, why would you incorporate something that didn't have anything to do with the house? It gives you maybe an insight into Lieutenant Gruszka, although his language remains super professional and very pragmatic, that perhaps Lieutenant Gruszka at the end of this investigation was starting to think this might be paranormal. After this story, 2 more police officers show up to the house to assist with this home study. One was Brian Miller and the other was Charles Austin. At this point, the 3 officers, Gruszka, Miller, and Austin, along with the case manager, Washington, begin walking towards the family and towards the front door of the house. LaToya says that she and her kids will not go back in the house because they had moved out very recently because of the strangeness that they claim was happening inside of the house. They felt like they were under attack by demons. And so the police, they needed someone to bring them in. And so Rosa, the grandmother, LaToya's mother, she offered to go in with them. So the house is a single-story, 3-bedroom house. You walk in and you're inside of the screened-in porch. You go into the main level. There's a few bedrooms, and then there's a stairwell that leads down into the basement. And so they go in, and Lieutenant Gruszka is in charge of taking pictures and recording audio the whole time they're in the house. They were not aware that they had already moved out. So it's a bit of an awkward home study because they're not even living there anymore. But either way, they're going to do their job. They're walking around, taking pictures of each of the bedrooms. There's 3 bedrooms, there's a kitchen, basic stuff upstairs. And then they go downstairs to the basement. Now, the basement was where LaToya and her family claimed the majority of the paranormal activity was taking place. The steps leading down to the basement were wood. They went down into the basement. The basement floor was concrete and the walls were concrete blocks. As they go down, Lieutenant Gruszka would notice that there were candles that had been placed all over the basement floor that had burned down to their wick. There was also an altar and a nativity scene that had been placed near the underside of the stairs. And so when Gruszka goes over to take pictures of the altar and the nativity scene, he recognizes that under the stairs, near where those 2 things are placed, it's all dirt. The concrete that made up the floor of the basement had been broken away, and there was jagged pieces of concrete where there should have been a continuous flow of concrete underneath the steps. It had been snapped up and broken away. It was gone. When Rosa was questioned about the strangeness of the basement with all the candles and the altar, she just said that there's a presence down here. And that's all she was able to articulate. The other officers and the case manager and Rosa, they go back upstairs, and Lieutenant Gruzka and Charles Austin, the other officer, they stay in the basement and take a few extra pictures, a couple more underneath the stairs, and just of the candles before they ultimately go upstairs as well. When Gruzka comes upstairs, Rosa's waiting for him, and she's about to turn the light off leading down into the basement, and she asks him, "Did you get any pictures underneath the stairs?" And he said, yeah, I did. I stayed down there and I took some more pictures. She looks at him and she says, "Sometimes at night when we're sleeping on the main floor, we'll hear commotion in the basement. It sounds like maybe someone bumping on the underside of the stairs. And then you hear footsteps walking up the wood steps. And whatever it is stops on the other side of the door leading into the main floor, and it will stay there for hours. We're too scared to open the door to look." Gruzka goes back to his office and he immediately uploads the pictures that he took with a focus on the ones he took in the basement. And he finds that there is a couple pictures he took under the stairs, that in the right-hand corner of the picture, just behind one of the steps, it's partially obscured, is a white mist or a white cloud. And he zooms in on it and he brings in other officers and they look at it, and if you zoom in close enough, it looks like a man's face. As they're zoomed in on this mist underneath the stairs, they can see, only because they've zoomed in, that there appears to be a faint green mist on the left side of the picture. It appears to be a woman's face. Gruzka and Austin, who were the only two in the basement at the time of these pictures taken, swear they did not see a white or green mist under the stairs when they took pictures. Gruzka, again, it doesn't say in the report how he's feeling, but you can imagine he's starting to feel a little bit uneasy about what he's witnessing. Gruzka just goes to his audio recording. And so he fast forwards to the section where he and Austin are alone in the basement taking these additional photos. And you can clearly hear on the recording Gruzka and Austin talking to each other as they're taking these pictures. And at some point, as they're taking these pictures of the basement, a third voice, not Austin, not Gruzka, say directly into the audio recorder,
Hey.
The audio recorder was one that Gruzka was used to using, and it had never malfunctioned before. And he and Austin were the only ones down there. And so they couldn't explain where the third voice was coming from, and neither could any of the other officers who listened to it. On April 30th, Gruzka set up a meeting with Latoya Ammon's priest, who she was very close with. They were regular churchgoers. This priest, his name was Father Maginot, he had been at the Ammon's residence 5 days before this home visit was done, when Latoya Ammons and her family was still living in that residence. And so Gruzka went to interview him to get a sense of what it was like when they were still living there. Father Maginot said he was there because Latoya had reached out and said, "I don't know what to do because she's claiming there are demons here." And while they're sitting in the living room on the main floor, Father Maginot is telling Gruzka that the bathroom light started flickering on and off. And so it was distracting enough that ultimately Father Maginot got up and walked over to the bathroom, and as soon as he went inside, the flickering stopped. And then he'd go back down and sit down, and it would start again. Repeatedly, Father Maginot would get up when it was flickering, he would go in and it would stop, he'd come back and it would start flickering again. So while this is happening and Father Maginot is going back and forth to the bathroom trying to figure out why the light is flickering, Latoya points out that a liquid is forming on one of the window blinds in the room that they were all sitting in. There was this oily liquid substance that was just kind of trickling down the window blinds. And Father Maginot walks over and looks at it. They're all looking at it, and there's no leak in the ceiling. There's no source for this liquid, and it hadn't been there before. At least that's what Latoya Ammons and her family is saying, that that's not from us. We don't know what that is. As they're looking at this oily substance on the blinds, the cord that controls the blind itself starts swaying back and forth. And everyone's startled as they're looking at it because there's no draft in the room, the window's not open, there's no reason it should be swaying. While they're looking at this cord, Father Maginot looks down and sees this huge footprint in the carpet near where they're standing that was too big to be his, and nobody else in the house had a footprint that was that big. At this point, Father Maginot doesn't think it's safe for the family to be there and advises her to leave. And this would actually be the episode that prompts Latoya Ammons and her family to leave the house and not come back. On May 10th, Lieutenant Gruzka, a new Child Protective Services case manager, and a host of police officers go back to the Ammons residence. The Ammons residence has been unoccupied with all utilities shut off, locked and sealed since the last time they were there, which was on April 27th. So it's a 2-week period that no one has been in the house. But there was a customary follow-up to this house. They had to as part of the home study. When Lieutenant Gruszka arrives at the property, outside is Father Maginot, as well as Latoya Ammons, her mother, Rosa, Latoya's 2 sons, Andrew and Amante, as well as a host of police officers. There's a canine unit that's there. Although it's not said explicitly in the report, it would appear that the reason there's all this additional police presence in a canine unit is because there's enough weirdness being reported about the house. There could be, a home invasion situation happening, that somebody else is living in this house. Any number of things could be happening, but they can't write off all of the strange testimony about what's happening in the house. And so before they go in for this second home study, they have one of the dogs from the canine unit go into the property and search the property for intruders, just in case this was a home invasion or something like that. They wanted to just check the box. So they send the dog in, the dog comes out, hasn't found anything unusual. And so the police, along with Father Maginot, the case manager, and Rosa, they go back into the house. The main level looked untouched. There was nothing strange happening in the main level when they walked around. Nothing was disturbed. It looked like no one had been here in 2 weeks. So they open the door to the basement, they turn on the light, and a couple weird things happen right away. One, they notice that on the steps, on the wooden steps leading into the basement, there is an oily substance with no clear origin that goes all the way down the steps, snakes around the side, and disappears underneath the stairs. As they begin walking down the stairs, the case manager from Child Protective Services happens to touch a cabinet that had been built into the walls along the stairwell leading down into the basement. And immediately she pulls her hand back. She grabs her pinky and she reacts like something had hurt her. And they ask, "Hey, what's going on?" And she's like, "I don't know, I just touched the cabinet and my hand now hurts. My pinky hurts, it's tingling." And it apparently had turned white. We don't have any images to show that, but her pinky basically had been wounded just from touching this cabinet. And so the officers go down into the basement, they follow this oily trail that goes back under the stairs, and they're thinking to themselves, all the utilities have been turned off. There's no reason there should be any water down here. Not to mention there's no origin for this oily substance. And no one's been in the house for the past 2 weeks. So we can't even account for this by saying that one of the family members might have spilled something. And so even though it's not written into the report that they were scared or that they were considering this could be beyond rational explanation, it's clear from what happens next that everybody there was ready to explore the idea that something was happening underneath the steps, because now the family's claimed there's been something crawling out of there and walking up the stairs at night. You have this strange oily substance coming from the underside of the stairs. You have the white and the green apparition inside of the pictures. Father Maginot suggested that if there was some sort of demonic possession happening in the house, that there's a good chance they would find things underneath the steps that were tied to the family. And so they decide they're gonna dig up the dirt underneath the steps. And so Gruszka begins digging into this dirt patch under the steps. And he makes it about 2 feet down. And he finds a press-on pink fingernail. He also finds women's underwear. And as he keeps digging, he finds a political pin, like for your t-shirt. He also finds the lid to one of the cooking pots from upstairs. He continues to dig and he finds some trash and miscellaneous papers, and it dawns on the group that someone or something is leaving the basement, going into the main section of the house, taking things from the family, going back downstairs, going underneath the steps, and burying them, and probably has been for some time. And so at some point they stopped being able to dig any farther. The soil was too hard, so they put the soil back and decide to leave the house. As they're leaving the house, Rosa is the last one to leave, and she actually says, "Hey, come over here." And she's standing in that screened-in porch, and she's looking up at the window blinds. On the window blinds in the house is that same, or it appeared to be the same, oily substance trickling down the blinds that matched the description of what Father Maginot had said he had seen when he was visiting the family before and saw liquid coming down the blinds. And so the officers reacted to this by saying, "Rosa, did you do this? Are you responsible for putting this liquid on the blinds?" And she said no. There was no clear source for this liquid. There was no leak, there was nothing. And so Lieutenant Gruszka wipes the liquid off of the blinds and tells everyone to leave the house. For 25 minutes they waited, and then they went back inside to see if there was going to be liquid there, and there was. And Father Maginot would say that after that first time he was there and he saw the liquid dripping down, he did some research, and it's very common over the history of time that if there's any sort of demonic possession in a house, that liquids will ooze from different areas in the house. And it's this oily substance that matches the description of what they just saw. At this point, Lieutenant Gruska and the police tell everyone to vacate the premise, they lock it up, and they leave. And that is the end of the police report. Although not included in this police report, where I pulled all of the story from, Charles Austin, who was the other officer who was in the basement with Lieutenant Gruska when they were taking pictures underneath the steps and they heard that voice on the recorder. Well, Charles Austin actually worked for another police department, the Hammond Police Department, and he took some pictures of the outside of this house during the time that no one was staying at the house. And one of the official police pictures shows a shadowy figure standing in the screened-in porch of this house right near where that liquid was dripping down the blinds. In 2014, Zach Bagans, who's a popular paranormal investigator, he hosts the show Ghost Adventures, he purchased the Demon House and filmed a documentary that he called The Demon House, and you can check that out for yourself, and he demolished the house in 2016. So I'd love to get your opinion on this story, because I told it based on information that was available in official police documentation. Now, that doesn't mean that it was paranormal, that this house was haunted, that there were demons there, but it at least makes you wonder what was really happening in that house. If you enjoyed this story, then please, if you would, kindly take the like button out for a nice seafood dinner and then never call it again, and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads that sound an awful lot like what you just heard. If you
You showed up late in a red dress glow, just on your heels and a kiss too slow. My name on your lips like a secret prayer. I tried to stay cool, but you knew I was there. Hey, you pull me close, then you slip away. One look from you and I lose my way. Mojar tu nombre,
If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. So whether I see you on TikTok, Instagram,